5 American aircraft went down. 11 men were killed. 2 more were captured. And it all began with the effort to bring one Air Force officer home. If you have seen the 1988 film Bat-21, you probably remember Gene Hackman hiding behind enemy lines while an airborne controller, played by Danny Glover, guides him towards safety. The movie preserves the most famous part of the story, a coded route built from golf courses. But the real operation lasted 11.5 days, unfolded in the middle of a North Vietnamese invasion, and ended in a way the film never showed. Hambleton was not lifted out by the pilot speaking to him over the radio. He was not carried away in a last-minute helicopter rescue. After the helicopters had failed and men had already died trying to reach him, a United States Navy SEAL and a South Vietnamese sailor entered enemy territory disguised as fishermen. They found a small wooden sampan paddled upriver through fog, past tanks and soldiers in the darkness, and hid the exhausted American beneath bamboo. By then, the question was no longer simply whether Lieutenant Colonel Iceal Gene Hambleton could survive. It was how many more men and aircraft could be risked for him, and whether the promise to rescue a downed American still applied when the rescuers themselves were being shot from the sky. The answer began on Easter Sunday, April 2, 1972. 3 days earlier, North Vietnam had opened the Nguyen Hue Offensive, better known in the United States as the Easter Offensive. This was not a small infiltration or a guerrilla raid. Regular North Vietnamese divisions crossed the demilitarized zone with tanks, artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and one of the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft weapons seen during the war. The timing mattered. American ground forces were being reduced under Vietnamization. The policy intended to place more of the fighting in South Vietnamese hands. The North Vietnamese attack was designed to test that transition at its weakest point. Bad weather covered the movement. South Vietnamese positions began to break. Roads near Dong Ha and Cam Lo filled with troops, trucks, armor, and guns moving south. American B-52 bombers were sent against the offensive. To help them operate in this suddenly dangerous airspace, 2 EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft flew ahead of a formation of 3 bombers. One of them carried the call sign Bat-21. The EB-66 was not a fighter. It was a large, aging aircraft filled with electronic equipment and specialists. Its crew searched for hostile radar emissions, identified threats, and helped the strike force understand where the North Vietnamese missile batteries were looking. The crew had avoided surface-to-air missiles many times before. Their defense depended on detecting the launch, understanding the direction of the threat, and making a violent break before the missile came close enough to detonate. That morning, the North Vietnamese missile crews changed the problem. After earlier missiles failed, they launched another pair and delayed activating the radar guidance. The warning came late. Bat-21 began an evasive turn based on the expected direction of the launch. A crewman shouted that the direction was wrong. The pilot reversed the turn. There was no time left. An SA-2 exploded beneath the aircraft at roughly 29,000 feet. The pilot gave the signal to eject. Hambleton, seated immediately behind him and connected to the first seat in the escape sequence, pulled the handles. His ejection seat blasted away from the aircraft. Seconds later, another missile struck. Bat-21 exploded in the sky. The other 5 men aboard did not escape. Hambleton descended beneath a parachute into a battlefield that American commanders had not yet fully understood. Below him were not scattered patrols. Tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops were driving across the border, supported by armor and air defenses. A forward air controller flying nearby watched him come down and heard the signal from his survival radio. The low cloud and haze that made flying so dangerous gave Hambleton one advantage. It helped conceal his landing in a dry rice paddy. He reached a patch of brush before nearby troops saw him. Some North Vietnamese soldiers were within a few hundred feet. The first fact confronting the rescue force was simple. Hambleton was alive, communicating, and technically inside South Vietnam. Under normal conditions, that suggested a fast recovery. A helicopter could come in low, a pararescue man could descend, and the survivor could be carried away before the enemy organized a search. But these were not normal conditions. The pilots who reached the area reported fire of an intensity they associated with the defenses around Hanoi. Small arms, automatic weapons, anti-aircraft guns, and missiles overlapped. The Cam Lo Bridge close to Hambleton's hiding place had become a critical route for the invasion. After another bridge at Dong Ha was destroyed, North Vietnamese traffic shifted toward Cam Lo. Hambleton had landed beside one of the arteries feeding the offensive, and he was more than a stranded airman. At 53, Hambleton had over 2 decades of military experience. He had flown combat missions as a B-29 navigator during the Korean War. Later, he worked with American strategic missile programs and electronic countermeasures. He possessed highly classified knowledge about radar, missiles, targeting, and strategic air command procedures. If captured, he would be valuable not only to North Vietnam, but potentially to its Soviet allies. That did not make his life more valuable than the lives of the crew sent after him. But it gave American commanders another reason to believe that leaving him behind was not acceptable. Hambleton found cover and established radio contact. He had injuries from the ejection and the explosion, but he remained calm enough to report enemy positions around him. Aircraft attacked the locations he described. Every transmission, however, carried a risk. The North Vietnamese understood American rescue methods, monitored radio traffic, and knew that the effort above the rice fields would eventually reveal where the survivor was hiding. The first rescue attempt formed quickly. An Army UH-1 helicopter, Blue Ghost 39, headed toward Hambleton with Cobra gunships providing cover. The crews crossed the Mu Jing River at low altitude and immediately flew into fire from several directions. The Cobra returned fire, but both helicopters were hit. Blue Ghost 39 tried to turn south. It could not escape. The pilot forced the damaged helicopter down miles short of Hambleton. One wounded crewman was able to move from the wreck. The others were trapped or badly injured. As North Vietnamese soldiers approached, the helicopter was struck again and burned. 3 Americans were killed. 1 was captured. The supporting Cobra escaped, but it was damaged beyond repair. 2 A-1 Sky Raiders that had been covering the mission returned with so many hits that both required extensive work. The quick rescue had lasted only minutes. Hambleton was still in his hiding place. Now another American was a prisoner. 3 more were dead, and the rescue force had created a second crash site inside the same enemy formation. This is the moment when Bat-21 stopped being an ordinary recovery mission. The enemy had demonstrated that it could destroy helicopters before they reached the survivor. Yet, the Air Force still had contact with Hambleton, and the tradition of combat search and rescue rested on a promise every aircrew understood: if you went down, others would come. If you enjoy discovering the history that war movies left out, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories, because the part Bat-21 omitted is where this mission becomes almost impossible. That night, aircraft remained overhead while Hambleton dug into the ground and waited. The Americans prepared a larger, more deliberate attempt for daylight. More rescue helicopters would come. More attack aircraft would suppress the guns. Forward air controllers would coordinate the route. But the North Vietnamese had also learned from the first attempt. They knew where the aircraft wanted to go. They knew why they were coming. And by morning, the man hiding in the brush had become bait inside a carefully defended trap. At first light on April 3rd, the rescue force returned with heavy helicopters and A-1 Sky Raiders. Low clouds covered the area. Pilots had to descend beneath the weather to find Hambleton, and every foot of altitude they lost brought them closer to small arms fire and anti-aircraft guns. Jolly Green 65 broke through the cloud layer and moved toward the survivor. Almost immediately, rounds tore into the cockpit and destroyed instruments. Its pilot, Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander J. Crow, kept the helicopter moving by using what he could see outside. He turned south and nursed the damaged aircraft back to friendly territory. Another helicopter followed and came within roughly 100 yards of Hambleton. The crew could see tanks and fire coming from nearly every direction. Its miniguns answered, but the aircraft was being hit faster than the crew could suppress the positions below. It too had to withdraw. The helicopters had reached the survivor's immediate area. They had proven that the route was physically possible. They had also proven that hovering long enough to extract him could destroy the aircraft and everyone aboard. The danger then created another survivor. An OV-10 Bronco forward air controller, call sign Nail 38, was flying low to coordinate the rescue. Captain William Henderson was at the controls, with First Lieutenant Mark Clark beside him. Ground fire brought the aircraft down. Both men ejected. Henderson landed north of the river, close to Hambleton, and was captured. Clark landed on the south side and avoided the search parties. The mission that had begun with 1 man on the ground now had 2 Americans evading the enemy, 2 in captivity, and several dead. Every attempt to solve the problem seemed to enlarge it. On April 4th, 10 A-1 Sky Raiders attacked positions around Hambleton. 8 came back damaged, 2 of them seriously. Weather stopped the effort the following day. Meanwhile, Hambleton remained inside his concealed position with no food. His water bottle was empty. He had radios, a weapon, a compass, medical supplies, and training, but none of that could replace calories, clean water, or sleep. He listened as aircraft circled above him and North Vietnamese troops moved around him. He also understood what every new sound meant. The men overhead were not operating in a distant battle. They were exposing themselves because he was still alive. On April 6, the Air Force assembled another major attempt. Attack aircraft struck around the survivor. 4 B-52s bombed the wider area. Dozens of tactical sorties tried to force the North Vietnamese gunners down. 2 HH-5E3 rescue helicopters approached under cover. The lead aircraft was Jolly Green 67, commanded by Captain Peter Chapman, a pilot who was close to completing his tour. The suppression appeared to be working. Enemy fire seemed lighter. That absence should have been reassuring. Instead, some of the rescuers feared it meant the guns were waiting. Jolly Green 67 crossed the river and flew toward Hambleton. Then the trap opened. Automatic weapons and anti-aircraft fire struck from multiple directions. The crew called for Hambleton to mark his position, but revealing himself could expose both the survivor and the helicopter. The aircraft began to pull away. It was already critically damaged. Jolly Green 67 flew east before turning southeast. Fire broke out in an engine. Parts of the tail rotor struck the main rotor. The helicopter rolled, crashed, and burned only a few hundred yards from Hambleton's hiding place. All 6 men aboard were killed: Captain Peter Chapman, Captain John Call, Technical Sergeant William Pearson, Technical Sergeant Alan Avery, Technical Sergeant Roy Prater, and Sergeant James Alley. Hambleton could see the smoke. Mark Clark, still hiding on the other side of the river, also understood what had happened. 6 men had died close enough for the survivors to know that their rescue had caused the flight. For Hambleton, that knowledge was almost as dangerous as hunger. Survival required him to keep transmitting, keep hiding, and keep allowing other men to come into the same fire. He briefly considered giving himself up. An airborne controller reminded him that surrender would not return the dead. It would only erase what they had tried to accomplish. The next day, another OV-10 was shot down while supporting operations in the area. First Lieutenant Bruce Walker and Marine First Lieutenant Larry Potts both survived the ejection, adding 2 more Americans behind the lines. Potts was eventually captured and died in captivity. Walker continued to evade for days, but would not come home. By the end of the operation, 5 additional aircraft had been lost directly in the rescue effort. 11 Americans were dead and 2 had been captured. Many more aircraft were damaged. Yet numbers alone do not explain the cost. Hundreds of sorties were diverted toward the rescue. At times, large areas around Hambleton were restricted to other friendly fire so the aircraft trying to reach him would not be hit by their own side. Those restrictions affected South Vietnamese units attempting to stop the invasion. American officers later argued over whether the rescue priority had allowed enemy forces to advance with less opposition. That is the moral pressure at the center of Bat-21. A military cannot promise that no one will ever be lost. But air crews were asked to fly into extreme danger partly because they believed that, if shot down, the United States would make an extraordinary effort to recover them. That belief protected morale. It also created a terrible question when the rescue force began losing more lives than it could save. On April 8th, General Creighton Abrams was briefed on the losses. The decision was made to stop further helicopter attempts. Hambleton was still to be recovered, but the method had to change. The most powerful American rescue aircraft in the theater could not reach him. The next plan required the survivor to move toward the rescuers. That created an immediate communications problem. North Vietnamese forces were listening. No controller could simply tell Hambleton to walk southeast for 400 yards, cross a field, avoid a village, and reach the Mu Giang River. A clear route broadcast over the radio would guide the enemy to him. The planners searched for something only Hambleton and people who knew him would understand. They found it in golf. Hambleton was an avid player with a remarkable memory for courses. His squadron could name a particular hole, and he could recall its direction and approximate length. A fairway running southeast for 400 yards became an instruction to move southeast for about 400 yards. Another hole changed the direction. A series of courses became a map hidden inside an ordinary conversation. At first, the message sounded absurd. Then Hambleton recognized what they were doing. Over the next 2 days, he would effectively play 9 holes through enemy territory. This is the part the movie made famous, and it was real. But the code did not magically rescue him. It asked a wounded, starving man in his 50s to leave the only hiding place that had kept him alive and crawl or walk through fields, damaged villages, and enemy positions. Each hole solved one problem and created another. If he stayed where he was, no aircraft could reach him. If he moved, he could be seen. If the directions were too precise, the enemy might decode them. If they were too vague, he could wander into a unit searching for him. The controllers tracked his progress from above. Captain Harold Ike, one of the forward air controllers, spent hour after hour maintaining contact. Other aircraft created diversions and attacked nearby positions. Hambleton moved at night and hid during daylight. Hunger weakened him. Dehydration clouded his thinking. The distance on a map looked small. On the ground, every yard crossed open terrain controlled by an invading army. Mark Clark needed a code as well. Because he was from Idaho and close to the river, controllers used references he could recognize. He was told, in effect, to reach the snake, enter the water, and float in the correct direction. The language sounded eccentric, but it concealed a simple plan. Clark would let the current carry him toward a ground team waiting downstream. The new recovery force would not arrive in a helicopter. It would move quietly along the river with South Vietnamese commandos. The American selected to accompany them was Lieutenant Thomas Norris, a 28-year-old Navy SEAL who spoke some Vietnamese and was already experienced in covert operations. His orders placed a strict limit on how far the team should enter enemy-held territory. The survivors were supposed to come to them. That restriction made sense on a briefing map. But when Norris reached the river, he saw columns of North Vietnamese vehicles and tanks moving nearby. Patrols crossed the fields. The current was stronger than expected. Clark and Hambleton were exhausted, separated, and unable to follow a perfect plan. The rescue force had finally abandoned the idea of overpowering the battlefield. Now, a handful of men would have to pass through it unseen. Lieutenant Colonel Andy Anderson organized a ground recovery near the Mu Jing River. South Vietnamese forces provided a ranger platoon and tanks to establish a small forward position. From there, Norris and a team of Vietnamese naval commandos would move toward the survivors. The plan was already dangerous before it began. Airstrikes intended to weaken nearby North Vietnamese positions brought an answer in rockets, mortars, and artillery. The forward base was hit. Anderson and several Vietnamese officers were wounded. One commando was killed. The covering force lost men, ammunition, and leadership while the 2 survivors were still across the line. Norris was left with commandos who spoke little English, and a mission that depended on exact timing. Mark Clark was closer, so he would be recovered first. After dark, the airborne controller told him to enter the river and let the current carry him downstream. Norris tested the water and decided that his own team could not fight that current by swimming upriver. They would have to move along the bank, farther into enemy territory than the original limit allowed. Norris took the team forward anyway. They passed patrols and watched vehicles moving near the Cam Lo Bridge. A single shot could bring hundreds of soldiers toward them. Norris chose concealment over speed. He pushed well beyond the distance he had been authorized to travel and placed his men where they could watch the river. Sometime after 2 in the morning, Norris heard Clark in the darkness. The exhausted pilot was floating with the current, breathing heavily. Norris was ready to move when a 6-man North Vietnamese patrol passed directly between them. He could attack the patrol, but gunfire would announce the position of the rescue team and the survivor. He remained concealed and watched Clark drift past. When the patrol disappeared, Clark had disappeared with it. Norris entered the water and searched downstream. His commandos worked along the bank. The river twisted through undergrowth and debris. Dawn approached, and with it the risk that every man in the team would be exposed. Near a sunken sampan, Norris finally saw movement. Clark was hiding nearby, confused and prepared to flee from anyone who found him. Norris lowered his weapon, identified himself, and used personal authentication information to prove that he was American. Clark came out. The expression on his face told Norris that the first rescue had succeeded. But finding Clark was only half the journey. Norris now had to guide a weakened pilot back through the same territory as part of a small ground patrol. They reached the forward position, where Clark received food and first aid before an armored personnel carrier moved him toward Don Ha. For the first time in more than a week, the operation had brought a survivor home. It also proved that a covert river approach could work. The question was whether it could reach Hambleton, who was farther away and becoming weaker by the hour. The golf course route had brought him toward the river, but progress that sounded simple over the radio had exhausted him. On one night, he managed to move only about 50 yards. When an aircraft dropped a survival pack containing food, water, ammunition, and fresh radios, it landed uphill and roughly 50 yards away. Hambleton could see what he needed. He no longer had the strength to reach it. Controllers watched him leave cover and stand exposed on a sandbar, signaling toward the aircraft. It was a sign of how close he was to physical collapse. They ordered him back into concealment. Another package was dropped, but he could not reach that one either. The temptation to send another helicopter returned. Everyone understood the urgency. Everyone also remembered Jolly Green 67 burning beside the survivor. The rescue force stayed with the ground plan. Norris tried to reach Hambleton with 3 commandos. They moved miles upriver through a dense concentration of North Vietnamese forces. The farther they went, the clearer the danger became. 2 members of the team refused to continue. Norris kept the group together and searched the shoreline, but they could not locate the survivor before daylight forced them back. At the forward position, the situation continued to deteriorate. North Vietnamese artillery struck again. 2 more South Vietnamese commandos were killed. Wounded men were evacuated. Norris now had fewer people, less protection, and almost no time. Hambleton's radio transmissions became irregular and difficult to understand. He had survived the explosion of his aircraft, the ejection, days without food, exposure, and repeated searches around his hiding places. But survival was no longer just a matter of avoiding the enemy. His body was failing. The original plan required him to move to the rescuers. That was no longer possible. Someone would have to go all the way to him. Norris was prepared to make the next attempt alone. Petty Officer 3rd Class Nguyen Van Kiet volunteered to accompany him. Kiet volunteered to accompany him. Kiet was a member of the South Vietnamese Navy's Special Operations Force, commonly described by Americans as Vietnamese SEALs or Sea Commandos. He had already seen the strength of the enemy positions and the losses at the forward base. He understood that this was not a short patrol to a waiting survivor. The 2 men might have to cross more than 2 miles of enemy-held ground, find Hambleton without revealing themselves, and carry or transport a man who could barely move. Norris warned Kiet that they might not return. Kiet stayed that they might not return. Years later, his explanation was simple. If Norris went, he would go. That decision is central to the real Bat-21 story. An American was trapped, but the final rescue depended on a South Vietnamese sailor who accepted the same danger when others had reached their limit. On the night of April 13th, Norris and Kiet moved up Triver. In a bombed-out village, they found local clothing and an abandoned sampan. Both men were small enough to disguise themselves as fishermen. They traded the appearance of a commando patrol for 2 figures who might belong on the river. The sampan offered speed and concealment, but almost no protection. A helicopter could absorb damage and still fight to escape. A thin wooden boat could be overturned or cut apart by a burst of automatic fire. Norris and Nguyen survived only if the enemy did not understand what it was seeing until they were already past. Fog settled over the river. They paddled quietly. Tanks and soldiers moved along the banks. At one point, Norris stopped to check his map and realized that 2 North Vietnamese soldiers were only a few yards away. The soldiers appeared to be asleep. The sampan continued. The fog concealed landmarks as effectively as it concealed the rescuers. When Norris and Kiet emerged from it, they discovered that they had traveled too far. The Cam Lo Bridge was above them. North Vietnamese troops and vehicles were using the crossing. The 2 rescuers had passed Hambleton's position more than half an hour earlier and paddled deeper into the enemy advance. They reversed direction. Moving south, they returned to the area identified by the controller overhead, brought the sampan to the bank, and searched the vegetation. Dawn was approaching when they found a man in the bushes. Hambleton was alive, but partly delirious. He had lost roughly 45 pounds. Some accounts say that in all those days, he had eaten only a few small ears of corn. The officer who had calmly directed airstrikes from the ground could no longer walk out on his own. Norris initially considered hiding with him until darkness returned. Waiting would make the river safer, but Hambleton might not survive another day. Staying in one place also gave North Vietnamese patrols more time to find all 3 men. They chose to move in daylight. Norris and Nguyen Shak placed Hambleton in the bottom of the sampan and covered him with bamboo and vegetation. To anyone watching from a distance, the boat still needed to look ordinary. The 2 disguised rescuers began paddling downstream with the man at the center of the largest rescue operation in Air Force history, hidden between them. For a time, the deception held. Then North Vietnamese soldiers noticed the sampan and opened fire. Norris and Kim T did not shoot back. Returning fire would remove any doubt about who they were and where Hambleton was concealed. They paddled harder, using the current, bends in the river, and vegetation along the bank to break the enemy's view. The boat continued downstream until it rounded another bend. A heavy machine gun was waiting. The first bursts forced Norris and Kiet toward the bank. They pulled the sampan out of the direct line of fire and overturned it for concealment. The thin hull that had carried them through the enemy now became the only cover between 3 men and a heavy machine gun. Above them, Captain Harold Ike was still on station in his OV-10. For days, he had been one of the voices keeping Hambleton connected to the rescue force. Now he could see the final attempt trapped beside the river. Norris called for help. American aircraft attacked the North Vietnamese positions. Navy A-4 Skyhawks from the USS Hancock came in low. A-1 Sky Raiders joined them, striking the firing points and dropping smoke between the sampan and the enemy. The air power that had failed to lift Hambleton from his hiding place was finally used in a different way, not to land in the trap, but to give the small ground team enough cover to move through it. Under the smoke, Norris and Kiet returned the sampan to the water. They placed Hambleton back inside and continued downstream. Friendly South Vietnamese soldiers eventually reached them near the riverbank. Hambleton could not walk. He was carried to the forward position and then evacuated in an M13 armored personnel carrier toward Dong Ha. After 11.5 days behind enemy lines, Bat 21 Bravo was out. The largest rescue operation in United States Air Force history had ended not with a helicopter hovering above the survivor, but with 2 men in fishermen's clothing paddling a wooden boat. That image changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The aircraft, bombs, electronic systems, and hundreds of sorties mattered. They maintained contact, suppressed enemy positions, guided the survivors, and protected the final movement. But the breakthrough came only after the rescue force accepted that repeating the same airborne method would continue to kill crews. Technology kept Hambleton connected. Improvisation brought him home. And the word home needs qualification. Hambleton was taken first for medical treatment and later evacuated to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. His recovery lasted weeks. The men captured during the operation, including Jose Astorga and William Henderson, would not be released until 1973. Bruce Walker, shot down while supporting the effort, survived behind the lines for nearly 11 days. When North Vietnamese troops finally closed around him, he warned aircraft not to attempt another rescue. He was killed, and his remains were not recovered. The 5 other men aboard Bat 21 had died when the EB-66 exploded. 3 members of Blue Ghost 39 were killed during the first attempted pickup. 6 men died aboard Jolly Green 67. Larry Potts died in captivity. The full human ledger extends beyond the neat summary attached to Hambleton's rescue. The official direct cost of the rescue effort was 5 additional aircraft lost, 11 Americans killed, and 2 captured, with many other aircraft damaged. Hundreds of people from the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and South Vietnamese forces contributed. The number of sorties and munitions committed made Bat 21 a case study not only in courage, but in the limits of rescue at any price. For American air crews, the willingness to make that effort carried strategic value. A pilot flying over hostile territory performed differently if he believed every reasonable attempt would be made to recover him. The promise created trust between the man in the aircraft and the institution sending him into danger. But Bat 21 exposed the hardest word in that principle: reasonable. When the first helicopter fell, the rescue force tried again with more planning and more firepower. When the next aircraft were damaged, it intensified the suppression. When Jolly Green 67 was destroyed, the meaning of persistence changed. Continuing exactly as before would not prove loyalty to the survivor. It would ignore what the enemy had demonstrated. The ground mission preserved the promise while changing the method. It replaced a large, predictable signature with a small team. It used personal knowledge as encrypted navigation. It used air power as cover rather than transportation. And it gave local South Vietnamese personnel an indispensable role in a story often remembered only through American faces. Thomas Norris received the Medal of Honor for the recoveries of Mark Clark and Gene Hambleton. His official citation describes a series of movements deep into heavily controlled enemy territory, first leading a patrol to retrieve one pilot, then returning in disguise for the second. Giu an Vishmentus Mendes Giench received the Navy Cross, the highest decoration the United States Navy could award to a foreign national. He was one of only 2 South Vietnamese servicemen to receive it during the war. Without him, there may have been no final attempt. Norris would have entered alone, or the mission might have ended at the river. The partnership did not end with a medal ceremony. Ki Hop's choice matters because it strips away the simplest version of the narrative. Bat-21 was not merely the United States refusing to abandon an American. It was an American and a South Vietnamese sailor deciding that neither would abandon the other while they went to find him. Hambleton also carried the costs for the rest of his life. He knew that men had died while he listened from the ground. He later expressed sorrow over the price paid for his recovery. When the remains of the Jolly Green 67 crew were returned decades later, his health prevented him from attending the funeral at Arlington, but he sent a message honoring the men who had come for him. Their story complicates any easy celebration. The rescue succeeded. The courage was real. So were the consequences for South Vietnamese units fighting the Easter Offensive while aircraft and fire support were diverted. Officers argued that restrictions created to protect Hambleton and the rescue force had made an already desperate defense more difficult. The exact indirect cost cannot be reduced to a reliable number, but the controversy cannot be removed from the operation. That is why Bat-21 became a watershed in combat search and rescue. The lesson was not that the military should stop going after isolated personnel. It was that determination could not replace threat assessment. When a conventional recovery was predictably failing, commanders needed other tools: special operations teams, deception, night capability, diversion, better suppression, and plans adapted to the particular battlefield. The operation forced a distinction between refusing to abandon someone and refusing to change a plan. Norris and Kiem Sot succeeded because they understood that those were not the same thing. Then Hollywood told a different ending. The 1988 film Bat-21 gave audiences Gene Hackman as Hambleton and Danny Glover as a fictionalized airborne controller. It captured the isolation, the radio relationship, the difficulty of moving through enemy territory, and the memorable golf course code. Those elements made the story accessible, and they preserved the central image of a navigator using his memory to survive. But the film compresses the timeline and replaces the actual recovery. Its climactic rescue does not show Thomas Norris entering enemy territory. It does not show Nia Han Vun Bihan Bull volunteering to accompany him. It does not show the fisherman's clothing, the sampan passing beneath the Can Lo Bridge, or Hambleton concealed beneath bamboo. That omission was not simply a filmmaker deciding that the truth lacked drama. Key details of Norris's role had remained secret for years, and the popular account that shaped the movie was written before the fuller operation became widely available. The result is an unusual reversal. Hollywood did not make the rescue more incredible. It left out the most cinematic part because the public did not yet know it. The film also centers the bond between the downed navigator and the voice above him. That bond mattered. Forward air controllers such as Harold Ike spent exhausting hours protecting Hambleton, guiding him and coordinating the aircraft that made the final escape possible. But the real ending expands the number of people whose decisions must be remembered. There was Mark Clark, whose shoot-down created another rescue and whose successful recovery proved the ground approach. There were the crews who entered fire that earlier aircraft had barely escaped. There were the 6 men aboard Jolly Green 67 who came close enough for Hambleton to see the price being paid. There were the South Vietnamese commandos killed and wounded at the forward position. There was Ki Humpt, whose name is absent from the version most viewers recognize. And there was Norris, who received a limit on how far he should go, saw that the survivors could not reach him, and kept moving toward them. Bat 21 is often described as the rescue of one man. That is true only if the story is viewed from the moment Hambleton was carried out. In reality, the mission became a rescue of multiple downed airmen, an air battle over an invasion, a ground infiltration, and a moral test of how far a military promise could extend. The answer was not unlimited firepower. 5 aircraft had already demonstrated the limits of that answer. The answer was 2 figures in a sampan, moving through fog with no armor, no room for error, and an exhausted man hidden beneath bamboo. That is the ending Bat 21 did not show, and it is the reason this was more than 11 days alone. Hambleton survived because hundreds of people refused to forget him, but he came home because Thomas Norris and Nguyen Van Kiet were willing to disappear into the enemy's world and bring him out quietly. If you want more forgotten war stories that sound impossible but really happened, subscribe and follow us.